He didn't have a rifle, not even a sidearm. Just the knife strapped across his chest, a tool most forgot existed in a world of optics, drones, and suppressed fire. But in that moment, cut off, bleeding, and alone, he wasn't a soldier with reduced capabilities. He was something else, something primal. The steel in his hand wasn't backup. It was finality. The mission had gone sideways within minutes. A routine patrol turned nightmare when the ground beneath the lead vehicle erupted in fire and shrapnel, tearing through armor and throwing bodies into the air. Communications fractured instantly, the sky filled with static and panic. Dust blinded, and the ambush wasn't just well-timed, it was coordinated. The second vehicle veered off the path, took a blast to the wheel well, and spiraled into a ridge. What was supposed to be overwatch turned into a scramble for survival. The squad scattered, returning fire in a chaos that made formation meaningless. Somewhere in that chaos, he was separated. Thrown, deafened, dazed, and bleeding from the temple, he crawled out from beneath fractured metal and earth. His weapon had been ripped from him in the blast. He searched in vain for a backup but found only smoke, cracked dirt, and a knife, the last tool tethered to his chest rig. Around him, muzzle flashes danced along the tree line. The air screamed with gunfire. But no orders came through. No voices. No call signs. The fight was happening, but it was happening without him. And that was the moment he understood. No one was coming back for him. There was no regroup, no exfil, no QRF inbound. He was alone, behind enemy lines, with a wound tightening in his leg and the sound of approaching boots not far behind. He moved instinctively, dragging himself into a burned-out irrigation ditch, tucking his body beneath collapsed brush, waiting with the knife clenched in one shaking fist. He didn't know how many were coming. He didn't know when. He only knew that if they found him, it would be face to face. No range, no cover. Just breath, bone, and steel. And they did find him. 6 of them. Loud, confident, arrogant. They called out to each other in half laughs, walking slowly like they were hunting something already dead. He stayed low. Let them pass. Let them get close. Then he rose. What happened next didn't make it into official reports. No footage captured it. No overhead comms recorded it. But when friendly forces returned to the area 24 hours later, they found 6 bodies. And 1 man walking. Limping, covered in blood. Face hollow from pain, eyes locked forward. He had no rifle, no ammo, just a blade. And the will to finish what the world assumed was already lost. The road had always been considered unreliable, a narrow vein of cracked dirt and gravel, winding between arid hills and valleys dotted with collapsed structures and half-abandoned settlements. But it was the only viable access route into the village suspected of harboring an enemy courier network. Intelligence reports over the last 4 days had placed high-value foot traffic between 3 points, and the mission was simple. Observe, intercept if confirmed, exfil clean. Nothing about it raised alarms, until it did. The convoy moved at a cautious pace, 2 MRAPs spaced apart by a tactical interval, cutting through the morning haze. Dust rose from their tires in soft plumes. The sun had barely cleared the ridge to the east, casting long shadows across the ravine walls. He sat in the second vehicle, back straight, eyes scanning the terrain through narrow slits of glass, armored against worse things than dust and wind. The lead vehicle hit the pressure plate at the turn, silent until the moment it detonated. The explosion was massive, a dull flash followed by a cone of flame and dirt that swallowed the road ahead. The front of the MRAP lifted and twisted as the frame ruptured, tires and plating shearing away in a bone-breaking scream. The rear of the vehicle crumpled like tinfoil, the shockwave tearing through the space between the 2 trucks. His vehicle swerved instinctively. The driver tried to reverse, but the blast concussion lifted the wheels off the ground. When they came back down, it was at a steep angle, off balance, off course, slamming into the embankment with jarring force. His head snapped sideways against the inner panel. Stars burst across his vision. He tasted iron. Static filled his earpiece. The engine whined once and then went dead. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, long enough for him to register that the glass beside him had spiderwebbed and that his rifle had come free from its sling and now lay somewhere beneath the twisted debris in the rear compartment. Then came the small arms fire. First in bursts, then a sustained rhythm. the familiar stutter of AKs fired too fast and too loose by excited hands. Muzzle flashes blinked from the hills to the left. Bullets cracked over the vehicle's roof and tore through the shattered windshield. One of the team dismounted early, returned fire, took 2 steps toward the ridge, and was cut down mid-stride. Someone screamed. The others returned fire, a chaotic burst of overlapping rounds as the squad tried to orient under pressure. He reached for his gear, but the left side of his vest had been shredded in the impact. His chest rig was ripped partially free, dangling from one shoulder. His sidearm was gone. He didn't think. He moved. Crawled through the bent door frame, boots dragging over broken glass, out onto the opposite side of the vehicle. His first steps were a stagger. The slope beneath the road had loosened in the blast, and when he tried to run, his foot sank. He tripped, rolled, felt rock tear across his thigh, and finally settled in a crevice no wider than his shoulders. It saved him. Enemy rounds stitched the dirt above him, but he was already below the line of fire. He pressed himself flat and listened, trying to make sense of the chaos erupting above. The squad was splintered. He heard one voice calling directions, then another shouting for cover. Return fire echoed across the basin, but it was aimless now, reactionary. The ambush was working, and no one had eyes on him. He tried the radio. Nothing. Just hissing. The antenna had snapped off in the wreck. He shifted, fumbled for his primary weapon, then remembered. It was still in the vehicle, or under it, or already burning. He checked for his secondary. Nothing. The holster strap on his belt was cut, the pouch torn clean. All that remained was the blade tucked into his chest harness, the Ka-bar he had carried for 9 years without ever needing it for more than cutting cord or opening rations. That's when it hit him. He was alone. Not just physically, but operationally. He was unaccounted for. In the chaos, in the crossfire, in the collapse of comms and coordination, his name had slipped off the roster. No one was calling for him. No one knew where he was. The squad was in retreat, bounding back under covering fire toward a fallback point half a click south. He saw their silhouettes ghost across the ridgeline, low and fast. If he shouted, he would be heard. But so would the fighters circling below. If he ran, he would be exposed. He stayed down. The firefight moved. The enemy pushed forward cautiously, unsure of what remained of the team, testing ground with careful advances and suppressive bursts. He stayed still, barely breathing, heartbeat climbing into his throat. He watched one fighter pass within 15 feet of his position, rifle loose in his hands, eyes scanning too high. The man stopped to light a cigarette, then kept moving. Minutes passed, then more. The sound of conflict drifted away, and silence returned to the valley, sharp, complete, and absolute. He waited. Waited longer than instinct said he needed to. Only when the sun passed behind a drifting cloud and the shadows lengthened again did he crawl from the crevice and assess what was left. Smoke still hung over the wreck. 2 bodies remained near the road. The enemy had stripped gear from one and dragged the other partially downhill. His own blood had dried across his cheek and neck. His ribs ached with every breath. He limped to a rock outcropping and crouched, watching the trail. Nothing moved. No one came back. He had no working weapon, no radio, one knife. His armor was cracked at the side plate. His water bladder was punctured and leaking down his leg. Still, he stood. He didn't panic, didn't freeze. He mapped the hills in his head, thought 3 steps ahead. If he could reach the old orchard ruins near the far edge of the basin by nightfall, he might find a well, or shelter, or a place to disappear for a few hours. He tore a strip from the lining of his vest, wrapped it around his ankle, and began walking. Slow, careful, angled low across the slope to avoid open ground. He didn't look back at the crash site. He already knew what he'd find, and what was behind him was no longer his concern. He had one job now: stay alive, long enough to make it matter. His first steps were deliberate, heavy, and slow, a limp more than a walk, each movement pulling tight at the bruised tissue along his ribs and the stiffening wound on his thigh. The adrenaline from the crash had burned off hours ago, leaving behind the cold ache of fatigue and pain, and still he pressed forward. The terrain turned more jagged as he descended into a shallow wadi that carved through the base of the valley like a scar. Loose rock and sand crumbled beneath his boots, forcing him to crawl at points, dragging himself on forearms worn raw from friction. The sun hovered at a cruel angle now, hot enough to sting through his uniform, but low enough to make shadows long and deceptive. The mountains around him seemed to fold inward, drawing him deeper into silence. No voices, no gunfire, no commands through the headset that no longer worked. Only the sound of wind curling through dead brush and the scrape of his boots on dry earth. He hadn't spoken in hours, not even to himself. There was no need. Speech required air and moisture, and both were in short supply. His water bladder had finally emptied, the last few drops squeezed directly onto his cracked lips before the plastic burst under the tension of the harness strap. He discarded it. Every ounce counted now, and weight that didn't serve purpose was a liability. He counted time by the sun and movement by terrain, estimating every kilometer crossed with a mental map patched together from the mission brief and what he'd seen from the ridgelines. He figured he'd traveled 4 clicks since the separation. Maybe 5 if he accounted for elevation gain. The orchard ruins were still ahead. If the intel had been accurate, they were no more than an hour's slow march to the northwest, nestled into a dry shelf near a dried-up irrigation trench. It wouldn't be much, but it might be shelter. And if luck still meant anything out here, there might still be water hidden beneath the surface, trapped in a collapsed well. As he moved through a cut in the hillside, he spotted movement to his left, quick and deliberate. A single figure on a ridgeline 100 meters above. He dropped instantly, pressing his chest into the dirt, heartbeat spiking like a hammer behind his ribs. Dust curled around his face, clinging to sweat and blood. He watched without blinking. The figure moved with practiced motion, rifle held low, scanning the slope, head turning with slow mechanical sweeps. Not a villager, not a wanderer. A search pattern. He waited, unmoving, for 10 minutes before the figure disappeared behind the crest. There were others. Had to be. Probably a patrol sweeping the area where the ambush was staged. Maybe they'd seen something. A boot print. A blood smear on the rocks. Maybe they just assumed someone had survived. Either way, they were hunting. And he was still the prey. He shifted only when the sun touched the edge of the hills to the west, casting a bronze hue across the sand and rock. Moving again meant risk, but staying still meant dehydration and exposure. He rose to a crouch and continued forward, staying low, dragging his injured leg when the slope made balance impossible. Every few steps he paused, checking the skyline, listening. The patrol hadn't returned, but the feeling of being watched never left. He traveled another kilometer before the terrain opened up again and revealed the orchard ruins below. What had once been a farm or settlement was now a grave of stone and timber. Cracked walls half-standing, roof beams collapsed and scattered, tangled scrub overtaking what used to be planting beds. He approached from the rear, careful not to silhouette himself. The silence here was heavier. No birds, no insects, only wind threading through broken wood and stone. He checked the perimeter first. No fresh prints, no discarded trash, nothing that suggested it was in use. He entered through a hole in the wall, knife drawn, steps silent. The air inside was dry and still, like the inside of a tomb. He found what remained of a well near the center courtyard, an ancient pit of stacked stone, partially collapsed but still deep. He dropped a pebble and listened. It struck water. Faint, shallow, but real. He pulled a piece of cord from his harness, tied it to an empty ration pouch, and lowered it slowly, inch by inch. When he pulled it back up, it was half full. Warm, muddy, but enough to drink. He drank it all, not caring about the grit in his teeth. Then he drank again. He filled a second pouch and sealed it. He spent the night in a corner room with 3 walls and half a ceiling, facing the approach from the south. He didn't sleep at first. His body ached too badly, and the sense of exposure crept under his skin. He sat with his back to the wall, knife across his lap, legs curled to his chest. The stars were harsh and bright above, burning holes in the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then silence again. He drifted off in bursts, waking at every sound, breathing through his teeth, dreaming of fire. In the morning, he was stiff and hollow, but still breathing. He checked the ridgelines. No movement. He drank again, tightened the wrap on his thigh, and re-shouldered his gear. He needed weapons. He needed distance. He needed a direction. He chose the East Pass, following a dry riverbed that cut behind the hills. It was slower, more exposed, but less likely to be patrolled. He moved at a crawl, scanning constantly, ducking at every echo. At midday, he found a carcass of a goat rotting in the sand, flies thick and angry. He took it as a warning. Someone had passed through here, recently. By late afternoon, he came across a ridge where the soil had been disturbed. Tracks in the dust, multiple boot prints, heavy tread. He counted at least 5 men, possibly 6. They had moved quickly, not in formation, but aware. He didn't follow. He circled wide, uphill, moving parallel. He needed a vantage point. At the crest, he saw the outline of a compound 2 kilometers east, walls intact, armed figures inside. Too far for details, but the structure was clear. He marked the location mentally, then backed off the ridge, slow and silent. He would return at night, not to fight, to take what he needed: a weapon, a reason, and a reminder that he was still alive. Under the cover of darkness, with the moon draped in a veil of cloud and the wind hissing lightly through the canyons, he began his approach toward the outer perimeter of the compound he had spotted earlier. Every step was calculated, deliberate, silent. The loose gravel and sand underfoot threatened to betray him, but his weight was low, his movement slow, and the terrain was now familiar to his eyes. He kept to the ridgeline's shadows, crawling at times on hands and elbows, slithering beneath thorned brush, his breathing shallow and paced. His body had adjusted to the pain. The torn muscle in his thigh throbbed with every motion, but his brain no longer registered it as a deterrent. Only background noise in the pursuit of a singular objective. He needed a weapon, and he needed to level the field. As he crept closer, the structure resolved into greater detail. The compound was rudimentary but serviceable, likely an abandoned home repurposed into a temporary outpost. Mud brick walls surrounded a dirt courtyard, and a rusted water tank perched lopsided near the edge. The guards were complacent. He watched them from 50 meters, tracking their movement with the patience of a man whose life depended on waiting. 2 men patrolled lazily around the outer walls, AKs slung low, their rhythm casual, predictably staggered. Another sat under a canopy smoking, his rifle propped beside him. A 4th man dozed on a wool mat with a blanket covering his chest. Inside the compound, faint lamplight flickered behind a cloth-draped doorway. From the way the shadows shifted, there were at least 2 more men inside. 6 in total. Maybe more. He marked their timing, their routes, and the blind spots they left exposed. He didn't attack. Not yet. First, he circled wide, moving down the hill under a dry stream bed until he reached the western wall of the structure. There, tucked beneath a collapsed portion of earth, he found cover. Low enough to remain invisible, close enough to listen. Over the next hour, he constructed a mental map, layering their movements, testing the wind direction, listening to the cadence of their voices. They laughed intermittently, speaking in rough dialect, tossing out stories and complaints between cigarette drags. They weren't professionals, but they were still armed. And he was still empty-handed. That changed just after midnight. When the first patrol passed close, no more than 10 meters from his position, he launched. It wasn't a fight. It was a strike. Fast, efficient, surgical. The knife punched through the side of the man's neck, angled and withdrawn in one continuous movement. The body dropped with a faint gasp, too soft to alert anyone beyond the wall. He caught the AK before it hit the dirt, rolled the man's body into the ditch, and melted back into shadow. 1 down. 1 rifle acquired. He checked the weapon, chambered, half mag, scratched but functional. Enough. The other patrolman turned the corner moments later and paused, probably waiting for his counterpart. He was confused by the delay, but not alarmed. That gave the SEAL a second advantage. He rose silently from the edge of the stream bed, flanked the corner wide, and dropped the second man with a controlled choke from behind, dragging him out of sight. It took less than 15 seconds. 2 weapons now. He left the second rifle, stripped the man's vest for mags and a grenade, and moved. He now had what he needed to control the terrain. Rather than press into the compound, he set the trap. He found a pile of metal scrap near the broken wall, sheets of rusted roofing, old engine casings, twisted fencing. He shifted it subtly, creating the illusion of disturbance, making it look accidental. Then he planted the grenade beneath the pile, attached to the wire torn from a bootlace, looped through a bent spike, tensioned just enough. It wouldn't kill everyone, but it would start the chaos. He positioned himself behind a burned-out vehicle chassis, 30 meters back, rifle sighted on the doorway. Then he waited. It didn't take long. One of the inside fighters eventually emerged, alerted by the silence of the guards. He stepped out, rifle half raised, and began shouting names into the courtyard. No answer. He took 2 more steps, spotted the disturbed metal, and moved toward it. The detonation was sharp and precise. Less dramatic than expected, but enough to rip the man sideways, shredding his lower leg and peppering the wall behind him. Screams followed. The camp erupted. 2 more fighters rushed into the open, blindly firing toward the edge of the walls. He dropped them both in controlled bursts, one to the chest, one to the neck. The others ducked inside. He repositioned, low and fast, flanking the opposite wall, approaching the entry from a blind angle. Inside the compound, panic took over. They shouted at one another, firing blindly through doorways and gaps. He could hear them shifting furniture, dragging weapons crates, trying to regroup. But it was too late. He was already inside. He moved through shadow like vapor, ghosting along the edge of the outer wall until he reached the main entrance. He lobbed a second grenade, pulled from the first guard's vest, threw the curtain, and ducked back. The blast flattened everything inside. Stone crumbled, wood cracked. One man staggered out, coughing blood, and was silenced before he could lift his rifle. It was over in less than 3 minutes. When the dust settled, he walked through the compound with the weapon raised. Each room was cleared methodically, 1 breath per step. No movement, no survivors. 6 men confirmed, 3 bodies inside, 3 outside. He collected what he needed. Ammunition, a second rifle, 3 canteens, a sat phone missing a SIM, 1 tablet with local comms maps, a pair of boots 2 sizes too large. He adjusted the laces and made them work. Before he left, he walked to the far corner of the compound and used a broken beam to scrawl a symbol into the wall. Simple. Deliberate. An arrow. Pointed north. He didn't know if anyone would find it. But if they did, they'd know someone had passed through. And they'd know what happened when he did. He took a final look at the bodies, then disappeared back into the dark, dragging his limp behind him and gripping the rifle with steady hands. The trap hadn't been about revenge. It hadn't been about pride. It had been about shifting the rules. Now he wasn't prey anymore. Now he had teeth. He didn't stop to celebrate. There was no time. The compound still smoldered behind him, its ruined walls glowing faint orange from the grenade blast, the smoke drifting like fingers through the early morning haze. The valley had grown quiet again, but not for long. By now, the sound of the detonation would have traveled across the ridgeline. If the fighters in this sector had any semblance of organization, a response team would already be moving in. He had maybe 20 minutes before someone showed up to check the scene. He moved fast, not running, but steady, using the terrain's dips and crags to put distance between himself and the blackened ruin. The rifle was slung low across his chest. It wasn't the best, some variant with a rusted receiver and a grip held together with twine, but it would fire. That was enough. He had 3 full mags, 1 half empty, and a stolen combat vest with the name tag cut off. The stolen boots were rubbing raw into his heels, but they were keeping his feet off the sharp rock. It was a trade he could live with. He climbed east toward a ridge he remembered seeing during the ambush route recon. A narrow spine of broken shale with enough elevation to offer a view of the valley and the dirt trail that wound through it like a dry scar. From there, he'd choose his direction, not at random, but with intent. He wasn't just escaping anymore. He had begun to plan. He wasn't waiting for extraction. He wasn't assuming anyone even knew he was still alive. He was operating on instinct, survival, and the very real understanding that he was alone and had to fight like it. He reached the ridge near midday, sweat burning his eyes, body trembling slightly from dehydration and overuse. He drank from one of the canteens and rationed the rest, then lay flat on his stomach behind a jagged slab of rock and watched the road below. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Then 20. Then, at the 26-minute mark, movement. A pickup truck, dust trailing behind it in a long gray smear. In the back, fighters. He counted 4 standing, 1 driving. The vehicle wasn't moving fast. They weren't expecting contact. They were responding to the noise, not anticipating another threat. That was their mistake. He stayed prone, adjusting his sight, calming his breathing. He waited until the truck slowed at a bend, then began a slow roll toward the smoke curling over the compound. That's when he moved. Not down, not across, but along the ridgeline, sprinting at a crouch to the far side of the rocks until he reached a descent point with a line of sight on the road. He got ahead of them. It took all of his energy and left his chest heaving, lungs full of fire. But he got there. Set his rifle against a rock. Prone. Steady. Waited. As the truck passed below him, he opened fire. 3 shots. The first struck the hood. The second the windshield. The third caught the driver in the upper chest, sending the vehicle swerving sideways. The truck veered off the path, slammed into a low mound of rock, and came to a stuttering stop. Shouts rose from the bed. Confused, high-pitched. He kept firing. 2 fighters jumped clear, ducking behind the side of the vehicle. One returned fire blindly, rounds skipping off the rock 2 feet from his face. He shifted his position, rolled 10 meters downslope, came up behind a new outcropping, and dropped the man with a burst to the shoulder and throat. The others panicked. One ran. One stayed low. The last stood to fire, exposed, yelling. He dropped that one first. The runner made it 10 meters before he hit a patch of gravel, lost his footing, and fell hard. The SEAL was on him in seconds. No rifle now, just the knife. Fast, silent, clean. The last man had hunkered down beside the rear tire. He was whispering something, praying maybe, when the SEAL appeared behind him, knife drawn, face covered in dust and blood, eyes hollow and distant. There was no hesitation, no noise, just the end. In less than 3 minutes, the response team was gone. He stood over the scene, chest heaving, weapon loose in his grip. He stripped their gear quickly, efficiently, took 2 radios, more ammunition, a cleaner rifle, 3 grenades, a fresh vest. He changed out boots again, took one of the med kits, tore open a packet of painkillers and swallowed them dry. He didn't stay to admire the wreckage. He dragged 2 of the bodies behind the wreck, threw dirt over the blood trail, wiped down what he could, and disappeared back into the hills. Now he wasn't just surviving, he was dismantling them. Word would spread. A team of 6 gone. Another patrol wiped. Equipment missing. Someone was out there. Someone who wasn't leaving tracks. Someone who wasn't afraid. He moved again before sunset, deeper into the range, circling a path that would take him past an abandoned radio tower he'd spotted during the first recon drop. If it still had power, or a battery cache, he might be able to get a signal out. Not a voice. Just a ping. Something to show he was still moving, still fighting. He camped just below the tower that night, nestled beneath a rock shelf with a view of the stars and his back protected. He didn't sleep long. 2 hours, maybe 3, waking at every shift of wind. He kept the rifle across his chest, the knife tucked beneath his thigh. He dreamed in fragments, gunfire, dust, broken glass, names he didn't recognize. In the morning, he climbed to the tower, dismantled a panel, and scavenged a working transceiver. The battery was weak, but it was enough. He sent a single burst. Coordinates. A date. A signature only someone who knew his habits would recognize. Then he shut it down and walked away. No words, no requests, just presence, just proof. He wasn't done yet. He still had more to take from them. By the time the sun had crested fully over the jagged hills to the east, the SEAL was already 10 kilometers into the march. His legs were raw with tension, each joint operating on adrenaline and willpower alone. The muscles beneath the skin rigid with exhaustion. Every breath came slow, shallow, a rhythm more out of necessity than effort. He wasn't moving with any urgency now, not out of arrogance but calculation. He knew the window was closing. The moment the ping from the tower was intercepted, every local cell within a 50-kilometer radius would be tasked with a grid search, combing valleys and ravines for a ghost they couldn't confirm was real. He needed to stay ahead of them. He couldn't hide anymore. Not successfully. Not for long. The terrain had shifted again. More open now, less shelter, fewer ridgelines, and more exposed plateaus that rippled outward into fractured stretches of desert. His only chance was to stay in motion, never breaking the rhythm, never giving them a stationary target. His destination wasn't a safe zone. It wasn't an extraction point. It was a possibility. A burned-out logistics checkpoint from an operation 2 years prior, long since abandoned after supply lines shifted. No one used it anymore, but it still marked a junction between multiple fire bases, deep enough to avoid constant patrols, but known well enough that, if command had received his signal, it might be the first place they'd check. It was still 20 kilometers away. Every step there would be earned. He adjusted the straps of his stolen vest for the 100th time, shifting the pressure off the laceration on his side. The medpack he'd taken had been enough to slow the bleeding, but he was out of gauze now, and the wound was starting to smell faintly of rot. His thigh injury from the earlier patrol fight had worsened. The skin around the gash had turned deep red, and each step made it feel like he was walking on splinters. Still, he kept going. He had learned to walk through pain, had trained for it. But this wasn't just training anymore. This was deeper. This was animal. At some point, the body breaks. And after that, what remains isn't technique. It's decision. He had already made his. The valley narrowed around noon, the heat now sharp enough to blister any exposed skin. He found a stretch of loose shale to descend and used his rifle as a crutch, digging the barrel into the dirt to stabilize his descent. Halfway down, his leg gave out and he tumbled, arms flailing, body twisting. He landed hard, shoulder first. The air punched from his lungs, the impact rattling the last of his strength. He lay there for nearly 10 minutes, unmoving, letting the sun bake into his back, letting the pain pool into his limbs like liquid. Then he rolled, groaned, forced himself upright, and continued. One step, then another. He passed through a dry creek bed where the bones of livestock had long since bleached under the open sky. Buzzards circled overhead but kept their distance. He didn't look like prey yet. Not completely. He followed the winding path, pausing only to sip from the last of his water and reassess his direction by the angle of the sun and the shape of the mountains he remembered from the satellite recon. He didn't need a compass. He had terrain burned into memory. By late afternoon, he reached the edge of the plateau where the checkpoint used to be. He stopped there, breathing heavily, heart hammering in his chest. Below him was what remained. A flattened stretch of stones surrounded by a half-collapsed wall, sandbags crumbling into piles, and a single rusted barrel half buried in the dirt. It was perfect. Isolated. Exposed on all sides. But still tactically sound for someone who wanted to be seen. He scanned it once, twice, checked for movement, then descended. The walk across the flat ground was harder than any sprint. His legs felt like they were filled with cement. His chest burned, his vision blurred with sweat. He reached the center of the ruin and dropped his gear slowly, carefully, kneeling beside a shattered slab of concrete where the old communications post had once stood. He unhooked the radio again. Dead. The battery had burned out. He threw it aside. It didn't matter. If someone was coming, they'd come now. The signal was out. He'd marked the location. He had done all he could. He sat back against the slab and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, just shut out the light. The silence around him was deep, complete. The wind barely moved. The desert felt like it was holding its breath. Then came the vibration. It was faint at first, barely detectable. A low hum beneath the sand. He opened his eyes. Listened. It came again. Thump, thump, thump. He didn't move, didn't hope. Not yet. He stood slowly, raising his head above the wall line. The sound grew louder. Distinct now. Rotor wash, fast, aggressive, closer. He turned toward the northwest, shielded his eyes, and saw it. A bird, low, moving fast over the ridge. Black silhouette against the sun. Doors open, guns mounted. He reached for his flare, pulled it from the vest, and waited. The Black Hawk banked left, scanned the plateau, slowed. He ignited the flare, smoke blooming orange and thick from his fist. The chopper adjusted immediately, dropped into hover. Dust whipped around him. Sand stung his face. The ramp lowered. A crewman waved him in. He didn't run. He couldn't. He walked, limping, dragging one leg. He crossed the plateau step by step, flare trailing behind him like a comet's tail. As he climbed the ramp, he let the flare fall. The smoke rose skyward. The door closed. Inside, hands grabbed him, firm, controlled. Someone spoke. He didn't respond. He dropped the rifle, collapsed into the hull, and let the dark take him. He had made it, on foot, through fire, with only a knife. And now they'd know what that meant. The flight back to the forward operations base was mostly silent, save for the steady roar of the rotors and the occasional check-in between the crew and the command post. He lay strapped to a litter on the cabin floor, half conscious, one arm pinned beneath a combat blanket soaked through with sweat, grime, and dried blood. His boots had been cut away, his thigh tightly wrapped in compression gauze, and an IV line threaded into the back of his hand pumped warm saline into his system at a slow, steady drip. His face was pale and bruised, lips cracked, skin darkened with sun exposure and unwashed layers of sand. He said nothing, eyes fixed to the ceiling, blinking slowly, barely responding to stimuli. His chest rose in steady intervals, and his fingers twitched every few seconds. Muscle memory trying to trace weapon drills that had carried him through hell. The medics didn't ask questions. They just monitored his vitals, cleaned what they could, and kept him stable. When they landed, it was after dark. The air was cooler, but carried that same fine dust that never fully settled. The ramp lowered, lights flashing against the concrete tarmac, and the crew moved fast, transferring him to a stretcher and wheeling him directly to the trauma wing. No crowds, no cameras, no celebration. Just a medical team waiting under harsh fluorescent lights, already gloved and masked, ready to act. They lifted him onto the table, began the scans, cleaned the wounds, and cut away what remained of his uniform. The doctors didn't speak to him. They spoke around him, reading numbers, checking for internal bleeding, noting the lacerations, the signs of infection in the thigh, the rib fractures, the early signs of dehydration-induced organ stress. One of them noted that his ankle had likely been sprained for days. Another mentioned the damage to his shoulder, partially dislocated from the fall near the shale ridge. But through it all, he remained awake, silent, alert, not flinching, not reacting, just staring at the ceiling as if still tracking threats. The next morning, after he was stabilized and sedated for rest, the reports began circulating through internal channels. There was confusion at first. His name had not been listed among the missing or presumed active. He hadn't been included in the recovery team logs because he had been categorized MIA with no GPS ping or radio verification. When the encrypted burst from the salvage transmitter came through, it was flagged as a data anomaly, then elevated, then verified. By the time the helicopter launched for extraction, there was already chatter building, speculation, disbelief, and quiet urgency. Command wanted answers. What happened? How? Why? And above all, how he was still alive. By day 2, he was transferred to a private room under restricted access. A team from Intel arrived shortly after, armed with files, timelines, and unanswered questions. They wanted a debrief, full account. But when they entered the room, he was sitting upright, staring out the window. When they addressed him, he didn't immediately respond. When they repeated the question, he turned, slow and expressionless, and asked for water. That was all. The rest could wait. The full report was compiled over the following week. Pages and pages of transcribed interview notes, photographs of the recovered weapons, GPS overlay of his route reconstructed from footprints, recovered drone footage, and the smoldering remains of the compound he had reduced to ash. Analysts mapped his movement across a stretch of terrain considered impassable for a lone operative without support. They noted the confirmed kills, 11 in total, not including the ones wounded or presumed dead from blast injuries. They documented the equipment he recovered, the supplies he left behind, the way he used terrain and silence as weapons. They reviewed the mechanics of his trap at the compound, and the forensic details of how he had turned a knife and a single grenade into an ambush that neutralized an entire patrol. Some wanted to write it off as anomaly. Others saw it as a test case. A few viewed it with reverence, but none denied what had occurred. He had survived not because of luck, not even because of skill alone, but because of something more elemental, an unwillingness to be erased. By the time he was cleared for limited physical therapy, he had already declined several requests for interview or recognition. He didn't want his name passed around in briefings. He didn't care for medals. His only request was simple: rotation silence, no public record, no unit debrief, just clearance to return to duty when medically fit. The request was granted, but his name traveled anyway, not in headlines or formal commendations, in whispered conversations between operators, in fire bases and camps where the only stories that mattered were the ones too hard to be made up. They called him different things: Ghost, Knife Hand, the one who walked out. The story passed through teams like a myth, growing at the edges but always rooted in the same brutal truth. That one man, with nothing left but a blade and a will sharpened by isolation, had taken on a valley of enemies and emerged, limping and bleeding but undefeated. He stayed on base for 2 more weeks. Then he disappeared again, reassigned to another unit, Another op, another name on a roster with too many black lines through it. No public record was kept, no mission file disclosed, but the footprint he left behind stretched wider than any satellite image could measure. Because some wars are fought on maps, and some are carried in the silence between footsteps, he had made the walk, and it had changed everything.